A black woman judge pulled over in her own car, in her own city, and accused of stealing it, not because of her actions, but because of what she looked like. What happened next didn't just shake a courtroom, it shook the conscience of a community. If you think justice wears a robe, you need to hear what she did next. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. It was supposed to be an ordinary drive home. The sun had just begun its descent over Savannah, Georgia, casting long amber streaks across the cobblestone streets of the historic district. Camilla Rhodes, a black woman in her late 50s, eased her obsidian Lexus to a stop at the corner of Whitaker and Gaston. The courthouse was behind her. A long day of arraignments and rulings done. Her robe still rested neatly on the passenger seat beside her briefcase. The car idled for a moment, long enough to draw attention. 2 blocks away, Officer Brian Cutter sat in his cruiser watching. He sipped lukewarm coffee from a plastic lid, tired eyes darting between the vehicle in front of him and the radio static humming in his ear. The Lexus. Black. Sleek. No visible plates on the rear. It rolled forward from the stop sign, a touch too slow. Cutter blinked. Instinct, he told himself, the kind you don't ignore. He flipped his lights and pulled from the curb, the cruiser humming with authority. Dispatch Unit 7. I'm initiating a stop. Black Lexus sedan. Possible match to recent auto theft report. Occupied once. Camilla saw the lights in her rearview mirror and sighed, not with guilt, not with panic, but with a kind of fatigue only certain people carry. She knew how this worked, knew the script too well. She pulled to the side, hands visible on the wheel, before Cutter had even exited his car. Evening air clung heavy as he approached her window. The moment he saw her, something shifted. It was quick, a tightening of his brow, the narrowing of suspicion into something personal. Evening, ma'am, he said, one hand resting on his belt. Do you know why I pulled you over? Camilla's voice was calm, unshaken. No, officer. I don't believe I committed a violation. Cutter scanned the interior. Judicial robe, leather briefcase, a face that didn't flinch. Still, something in him refused to let go. License and registration, please. She handed both over. I'm Judge Camilla Rhodes, 5th Circuit, heading home from the courthouse. Cutter didn't react. He didn't nod, didn't acknowledge the title, just flipped the documents open like they were counterfeit. This car, he said, matches the description of a vehicle reported stolen earlier today. Camilla tilted her head slightly. It's registered to me. You can verify that. I will, he replied, already walking back toward his cruiser. The crowd hadn't formed yet. The street was quiet, still intimate enough to mistake the unfolding tension for something routine. Inside his car, Cutter radioed in the license plate and VIN. Dispatch responded in under a minute. Vehicle registered to Camilla Rhodes. No reports on file. All clear. Still, Cutter didn't return her documents. He approached the car, again, slower this time. Voice more clipped. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Camilla blinked once. Is that a lawful order? Yes. Am I being detained? A pause. Just step out so we can clear a few things up. Her spine straightened. You've confirmed the car is mine. You've seen my identification. What exactly are we clearing up, officer? Down the street, a teenager stopped walking, pulled out his phone. The red recording light blinked. I'm not asking again, Cutter said. Camilla spoke louder now, not aggressive, but deliberate. This is unlawful. I have done nothing suspicious, and you have no probable cause. His hand hovered near his holster, not touching, but close enough to signal. Power flared in the air, sharp as static before a storm. And people noticed. She's a judge. Someone called from across the street. Man, don't do this. But Cutter didn't move. Neither did Camilla. A beat passed, then another. You're escalating this, she said. Because I don't look like what you expect a judge to look like. The words weren't sharp. They were scalpel precise. And Cutter, exposed under a camera lens now blinking steadily from the sidewalk, felt it. Another cruiser pulled up behind his. Officer Maria Bennett stepped out. Late 30s. White. Her ponytail swung as she walked toward Cutter, quickly surveying the scene. That's Judge Rhodes, she muttered. What's going on? Possible match to a stolen vehicle, he mumbled. She's cleared. She's not cooperating. Bennett looked at him sideways. She's asserting her rights. There's a difference. Camilla rolled down her window 2 more inches. Her tone cut clean through the humid air. Officer Bennett, I'm requesting to leave unless I am formally detained. Bennett nodded slowly. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I'll handle this. But Cutter wasn't done. He wasn't ready to let go. Not of the suspicion, not of the authority. He took 1 step forward, his hand brushing Camilla's doorframe. She exited the vehicle without raising her voice. Not in retreat. In declaration. I know what this is, she said. And so does everyone watching. Phones were up now, 4, maybe 5. The air had shifted. Not with fear, but with witness. You saw a black woman in a luxury car, she said, standing still, judicial robe, visible in the passenger seat. And you assumed it couldn't belong to her. No one said that, Cutter muttered. You didn't have to. A ripple of murmurs moved through the small crowd. You knew who I was, she added. You just didn't believe I could be who I said I was. Cutter looked past her now, scanning the crowd for backup that wouldn't come. Bennett stood behind him, arms crossed. Camilla's voice lowered almost a whisper. You think this ends here, but it doesn't. Not for me. Not for you. Not for anyone watching. And then, like a judge issuing a verdict, she turned back to her car, retrieved her documents from his hand without asking, and stepped back into the driver's seat. She didn't speed off. She didn't look back. She simply pulled away, calm, intact, and carrying more truth than any badge on that street. The stop was over. But the story was just beginning. The morning after the stop, Camilla Rhodes sat alone in her kitchen, the hush of dawn brushing against the windows. The house was quiet, filled with shadows and the faint tick of the clock above the stove. Her coffee had gone cold untouched. On the table lay her judicial badge, her Lexus registration, and a folded copy of the Savannah Times. The headline didn't name her, but the story was clear. Black woman judge detained in traffic stop raises questions about racial bias. She didn't need to read it. She had lived it. Across the city, Officer Brian Cutter reviewed his own report, searching for the right language to dull what the cameras had captured. He framed it around standard protocol, a reasonable match to a reported vehicle. Nowhere did he write what he saw when he first walked up to her window. Not a judge, not a professional, just a possibility he'd been taught to fear. Camilla sat straighter in her chair, replaying his face in her mind, not in anger, but in study. Because this wasn't about Cutter alone. It was about everyone like him, everyone who looked at her and saw something less, something unearned, and still she hadn't yelled, hadn't flinched. That wasn't her power. Her power was in knowing exactly what she was worth, even when someone else tried to rewrite it in real time. Later that morning, she entered the Fifth Circuit Courthouse, not in silence, but in quiet purpose. The same halls she had walked for over a decade now felt different. Clerks glanced up longer than usual. A bailiff who had always greeted her with a smile looked away. Rumors travel faster than facts, and silence can feel like betrayal. She stepped into courtroom 4A robe, crisp gavel in hand. Her docket was full. Cases of evictions, small claims, motions to suppress people who had waited weeks for their 10 minutes before a judge. She gave them her full attention, her full grace. Because what happened on that street corner hadn't stolen her dignity, it had only sharpened it. But the tension lingered. Every knock of the gavel seemed to echo louder than before, every glance from the gallery tinged with something unspoken. Midway through the afternoon, her clerk, a young white woman named Elise, leaned in and asked gently, "Judge Rhodes, are you okay?" Camilla looked up steady. "I'm not broken. I'm not even bruised. But I am tired. Tired of being invisible and hyper-visible at the same time. Of earning every inch and still being asked to prove I belong." The weight of that landed heavily between them. Elise nodded, a hint of tears brimming. By day's end, Camilla remained behind in the courtroom. The chairs were empty, the room silent. She stood in front of the bench she'd occupied for years and looked out at the rows. It wasn't the bench that gave her authority. It was the clarity that came with sitting on it after being mistaken once again for someone she was not. Or rather, someone they refused to see. "You didn't see me," she whispered into the emptiness. "Not the way I deserve." She walked back to her chambers and began to write. Not a formal complaint, not a speech, but a letter. To her city. To anyone who had ever looked past someone who should have been seen. In it, she didn't recount the entire event. She didn't need to. She wrote about presence, about assumptions, about how justice must start not with rules, but with recognition. Because when you fail to see someone's humanity, it doesn't matter how much they've achieved, you'll always find a reason to question their right to exist in a space they've earned. Camilla didn't want vengeance. She didn't need apologies. She needed the world to sit with the discomfort of its own blindness. As the sun dipped again behind the skyline, she folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it on her desk. Tomorrow, she would bring it to the editorial board herself. She wouldn't wait for someone else to speak her truth. And when she stood at her window that night, the same window she'd stood at hundreds of times before Savannah looked different. Not smaller, not crueler, just clearer. She didn't need them to understand her strength. She needed them to reckon with why they never expected her to have any at all. 3 days after the stop, Judge Camilla Rhodes stood behind a podium in a modest town hall on the east side of Savannah, not as a speaker invited for prestige, but as a citizen compelled to break the silence. The room was crowded. Folding chairs scraped the floor. The air smelled faintly of dust and sweat. No cameras, no officials, just people young and old, black and brown, weary and wide-eyed. Many of them didn't recognize her by face, only by name. But they knew the story. They had read it, shared it. Some had lived echoes of it themselves. Camilla adjusted the microphone, though she didn't need it. Her voice carried differently now, not louder, just fuller, like someone who had finally stopped asking to be heard. "I'm not here," she said, "to talk about a traffic stop. I'm here to talk about what it revealed." A hush fell. When you spend your life inside the system, interpreting it, upholding it, you learn its language. You learn how it works, where it bends, how it protects. But there are moments she paused when you realize the cracks weren't accidental. They were designed. She spoke for 10 minutes. Not about herself, but about every mother detained for asking too many questions, every teenager followed too closely through a department store, every professional who wore their credentials like armor because they knew their skin would speak first. Then she sat down, not because she was finished, but because the room needed space to speak back. A woman in a Walmart uniform raised her hand. "What do we do," she asked, "when the people who hold the rules refuse to follow them?" A man with a gray beard followed. "How do you teach your son to trust the law when it don't trust him?" Camilla didn't have perfect answers, but she listened. And in that listening, something opened. In the days that followed, what began as a small gathering grew. Community centers across Savannah began hosting justice forums, open-door nights, where residents could come and speak not to power, but around it. Camilla attended everyone she could. She didn't speak often. She didn't lead. She sat in the middle rows, eyes steady, absorbing every word. One teenager stood up and said, "I didn't know a judge could go through what I go through." Camilla met his eyes. "Neither did some of my colleagues," she answered. But the forums were more than stories. They became blueprints. People talked about training programs, accountability reviews, citizen oversight boards. A young organizer named Lena suggested creating a database of complaints publicly accessible, regularly updated, not to destroy reputations, but to disrupt patterns. Camilla supported the idea, but added something else. We need education too. Not just for officers, for everyone. For the teachers who overpunish black kids. For hospital staff who ignore pain reports. For landlords who lose applications. Systemic racism didn't live only in courthouses or traffic stops. It was in spreadsheets, policies, hiring decisions, neighborhood lines. And now people were naming it out loud. Meanwhile, inside the judicial branch, whispers turned to pressure. Some thought Camilla had gone too far by speaking publicly. Others called her brave. A few colleagues sent short, careful emails. "Thinking of you. Appreciate your leadership." No one from the police department reached out. But the real shift came from the outside. In the week following the story's spread, over 150 residents submitted written accounts to the Municipal Ethics Board stories of stop searches, denied services, subtle humiliations. For years, these stories had existed in isolation. Now they had a container. Camilla read them all. One in particular stayed with her, a letter from a black attorney named Davina, who had once been stopped outside a courthouse in Atlanta, briefcase in hand, and asked which defendant she was visiting. That moment, the letter read, made me question everything I'd sacrificed to stand where I stood. Camilla saw herself in that. Not just the pain, but the betrayal. You work twice as hard, climb each rung with care, and still the system pulls you aside and says, "Prove it." That week, she met with Judge Marquez, head of the Georgia Judicial Review Council. They spoke for over 2 hours. At the end, she made her request a statewide equity audit of courthouse procedures and personnel starting with law enforcement interactions. He didn't promise action, but he promised not to bury it. Outside the formal channels, Camilla focused on something else: visibility, not of herself, but of others. She invited high school students to sit in on proceedings. She opened her chambers once a month to young law students of color, offering mentorship and transparency. She worked with a local filmmaker to begin collecting oral histories from everyday people who had endured institutional bias, creating a living archive of voices the courtroom had never heard. Because the system didn't just crack under pressure, it cracked when it was built without listening. And for the first time in years, people were starting to speak into those gaps. One evening, as she left the courthouse, a woman tapped her shoulder gently, middle-aged, well-dressed eyes brimming. "Judge Rhodes," she said, "I work in HR at the hospital down the road. Last month, I saw security tail a black nurse through the lobby because they didn't believe she worked there. I didn't say anything. But after what happened to you, I filed a report. I made them review the tapes. I don't know if it'll matter, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Camilla took her hand. "It matters," she said, "because silence is where injustice learns to breathe." They stood there, just two women on a street corner, the city around them, humming as always. But something had changed. The traffic stop hadn't broken her. It had broken the myth of neutrality, the belief that the system untouched would somehow right itself. Now the cracks were visible, and light was finally getting in. The Savannah Police Department's briefing room had never been this quiet. Chief Alan Whitlow stood at the head of the long table, hands clasped, a man who once spoke with unquestioned authority, now feeling the ground beneath him shift. Before him were 24 officers, captains, lieutenants, and command staff. And projected behind him, in looping silence, was the body cam footage. The moment, the stop, the pause between Camilla Rhodes stating her name and Officer Brian Cutter's hand resting casually, too casually, on the grip of his holstered weapon. The video had no narration, but it didn't need one. The story wrote itself in posture and pause, in suspicion and stillness. In the face of a woman who had spent her life interpreting the law, now made to defend her right to exist within it. Chief Whitlow cleared his throat. "We're not here to discuss what the footage looks like," he began. "We're here to acknowledge what it reveals." No one spoke. No one dared. For years, the department had prided itself on progressive training and implicit bias seminars. They had the plaques, the press releases, the pilot programs. But none of that could shield them now. Because what played on the screen wasn't a fluke. It was a mirror. And the reflection wasn't easy to accept. Brian sat off to the side, uniform crisp, expression unreadable. This was not his first time in a review room, but it was the first time he wasn't certain the shield of procedure would protect him. He'd written his report, filed it within the hour of the stop. Vehicle matched general description of a possible stolen car. Driver displayed unusual composure, potential evasiveness. He hadn't expected that report to go viral. He hadn't expected the driver to be a judge. And he certainly hadn't expected the world to take her side. Outside the department walls, something was brewing. Protests had formed, but they weren't loud or chaotic. They were steady, quiet, made of teachers, nurses, veterans' parents, holding signs that didn't scream for punishment, but for truth. Across the city, stories spilled open, one by one. A man described being cuffed outside his own home for matching a description. A woman recounted being followed through a high-end department store, only to find herself cornered by plainclothes security. A retired school principal told how he once had to call a white colleague to the courthouse so someone would believe he was there for jury duty. Camilla watched this unfold not from a distance, but up close. Her chambers became a makeshift command center, not of power, but of purpose. She read emails, sat with residents, took calls from young attorneys who had once believed decorum was enough to protect them. But it wasn't about her anymore. She understood that. She was simply the flashpoint, the face the mirror reflected back at the system. At a press conference days later, Camilla stood behind a wooden lectern, a single sheet of paper in her hands. "I did not ask to be a symbol," she said, eyes steady, "but I will not refuse the responsibility that's been placed in my hands. Because if a judge can be profiled, it means the cracks in this system are deeper than any of us have wanted to admit." She called for accountability, not just of Officer Brian Cutter, but of every department whose procedures left room for gut instinct to overpower facts. She proposed mandatory transparency in stops involving public officials, not to elevate them, but to spotlight how even power can't protect when prejudice is involved. That same day, the City Council voted unanimously to launch an independent review board. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Officer Brian Cutter was summoned to appear before an internal ethics committee. He walked into the hearing with his lawyer beside him, a carefully pressed suit replacing his uniform. The room was sterile, the kind where truth can suffocate under the weight of bureaucracy. Camilla did not attend. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than she ever could. Still, behind closed doors, she knew what they would say. That he followed protocol, that his concern was justified by the situation. That her calm demeanor was interpreted as potential concealment. That's how systems protect themselves, not by denying facts, but by distorting context. But this time, the context had already escaped containment. In a closed session, one committee member, a former federal prosecutor, posed a single question to Brian. "Would you have stopped her if she were white?" Brian blinked. "I can't speculate." "You don't need to," the prosecutor said. "Because you already did." Outside, reporters waited, not for scandal, but for clarity. Inside the courthouse, Camilla prepared for another hearing, a custody case. No cameras, no press. Just a grandmother trying to raise her granddaughter while battling red tape and exhaustion. Camilla sat on the bench, same as always. Robe, heavy, mind sharp. But something inside her had shifted, because now she knew the bench did not shield her from the system's cracks. It merely raised her high enough to see how wide they ran. After court, she walked to the clerk's office and signed the final paperwork, launching a new initiative, the People's Record. A digital archive of courtroom interactions, anonymous, verified, voluntary. A place where defendants, plaintiffs, witnesses, and visitors could share how they were treated, not just what was ruled. She worked with law students and retired judges to create guidelines, not for punishment, but for pattern. Because data tells a story systems can't ignore. A week later, the first results came in. Over 700 entries in 5 days. Patterns emerged. Certain judges cut off female attorneys mid-sentence. Certain officers stopped black drivers 4 times as often in one district. Certain bailiffs refused to pronounce non-Anglo names correctly. It was the mirror again. And now everyone was forced to look. One evening, after a long day of court, Camilla walked alone through Forsyth Park. The moss-draped trees swayed gently above. A teenage boy skateboarded past, did a double take, and skidded to a halt. "You're the judge from the video," he said. She nodded. "My mom watched it 5 times," he said. Said it made her cry. Said, said she felt seen. Camilla smiled softly. "Tell your mom thank you." The boy hesitated. "Do you think it's going to change anything?" She thought for a moment. "I think mirrors don't change what they reflect," she said, "but they force people to decide if they're okay with what they see." He nodded slowly, then pushed off again. Camilla stood beneath the Spanish moss, the night air thick with questions the system could no longer ignore. Because what had been exposed wasn't just one officer. It was every assumption, every shrug, every silence that had let it happen. And now, those who'd turned away for too long were staring into the mirror. And for the first time, it was staring back. The day began like most others, with a humid hush hanging over the city of Savannah. But something in the air was different, an electric stillness, like the moment just before thunder cracks. Outside the Chatham County Courthouse, people gathered without being summoned. No formal announcement, no official rally. Just word passed from neighbor to neighbor, inbox to inbox. Today she returns. Judge Camilla Rhodes arrived just before 9 a.m. Her silver-trimmed robe folded neatly over one arm, the other clutching a single manila folder. She parked her car, the same black vehicle that had once been treated like evidence, and stepped out with a composure so rooted it felt like an answer to a question the city had been asking for years. By the time she reached the courthouse steps, they were lined with faces familiar, new, skeptical, reverent. A young girl with braided hair held her mother's hand tightly. An elderly man in a crisp Sunday suit nodded slowly as she passed. Even some city officials stood in silence, not to be seen, but to witness. Camilla didn't pause for the cameras. She didn't wave. She walked. Inside the courtroom was already filled, but not just with lawyers and court clerks. There were teachers from the local high school, law students from the University of Georgia, a bus driver who had taken a personal day, an artist who'd painted her portrait from the live stream footage and left it unsigned at her chambers. All of them sat not as spectators, but as reminders. At exactly 9:30, Camilla stepped to the bench. No bailiff announced her. No gavel tapped. She simply looked up and began. "For those of you expecting business as usual," she said, voice clear, "you may be disappointed. Today we begin with acknowledgement." The room leaned in. Justice, by its nature, does not exist in theory. It lives or dies in the daily decisions of those entrusted to carry it. I stand here not as a symbol, but as evidence. Evidence that even the robes we wear and the oaths we take do not shield us from the weight of perception, from the consequences of assumption. She let the silence hang thick and breathing. I was stopped. I was doubted. And I was not alone. Then she pulled from the folder a stack of printed pages, the first official report from the People's Record. She read excerpts aloud. No names, just truths. A public defender whose client was referred to as that one instead of by name. A court interpreter told to hurry up while translating a child's abuse testimony. A disabled woman denied a seat in a holding cell because she didn't look handicapped. Each voice echoed, each sentence pressed. This record is not to shame, Camilla said. It's to remind us who we serve. In the back of the room, Officer Marin Alcott, a quiet patrol woman who had once hesitated to speak against her own captain, lowered her head and wept softly. Not from guilt, but from recognition. Outside, more had gathered. The sidewalk filled shoulder to shoulder. A woman from Charleston held a sign that read, "I see you, Judge Rhodes." A teenage boy wore a t-shirt with her silhouette and 3 words underneath, "Respect, regardless, always." And then came the moment no one had planned. One by one, people in the courtroom began to rise. No cue, no music, no coordinated movement, just motion, born of reverence. A young black woman stood first, an aspiring law student who'd watched Camilla's story unfold like a reflection of everything she feared and hoped. Then a Latino court translator. Then a white male bailiff who had served under 3 different chief judges and never seen a courtroom rise without being asked. They stood for her, but also for themselves, for what they believed justice should look like, sound like, feel like. Camilla didn't ask them to sit. Instead, she closed her folder and looked across the sea of faces. If this is what accountability looks like, she said, then let it be the foundation, not the finish. She stepped down from the bench, not above them, but among them. And for the first time in a long while, Savannah looked up, not at a scandal or a soundbite or a stereotype, but at a woman who had walked through fire and returned not burnt, but burning. Because this wasn't the end of her story. It was the day the city remembered how to listen and how to stand. Judge Camilla Rhodes' journey began with a single assumption: a white officer who saw a black woman behind the wheel of a luxury car and decided she didn't belong. That moment, rooted in racial bias disguised as suspicion, could have ended in silence like so many others before it. But Camilla chose a different path. She didn't shrink. She didn't explode. She stood, and in doing so, she turned a personal injustice into a citywide reckoning. What happened on that quiet street in Savannah wasn't just about one stop, one car, or one officer. It was about how systems fail when they are built on fear instead of fairness. It was about how authority unchecked can become blind, and how even those who wear the robe symbols of justice and balance are still vulnerable to the very prejudices they fight daily in courtrooms. Camilla's strength was not in her title. It was in her choice to confront the harm without becoming hardened by it. She didn't ask for pity. She demanded change. She met resistance not with rage, but with reason. She built bridges instead of walls, starting conversations, inviting community voices, and crafting reforms that would outlast her moment in the spotlight. She reminded Savannah and the nation that dignity doesn't ask for permission, and justice doesn't wait to be recognized. The courtroom, where she was once almost erased, became the place where the truth stood tallest. Not because one woman shouted louder, but because she refused to be silenced. The lesson here is clear power without perspective is dangerous. And silence, especially in the face of bias, is not neutrality, it's complicity. If we want justice to mean something real, it must be more than procedure. It must be presence, participation, empathy, and courage. In our daily lives, this means more than sharing outrage online. It means noticing the quiet wrongs around us and calling them out. It means looking beyond uniforms and robes and seeing the humanity in each other. It means teaching our children that respect isn't about rank, it's about right. That every person, regardless of appearance, is worthy of fair treatment and the benefit of belief. Camilla Rhodes's story didn't end in that courtroom. It continues in every conversation she sparked, every policy she inspired, and every young person who now sees the legal system as something they can shape, not something to fear. If this story moved, made you reflect, or gave voice to something you felt, but never said, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel. Help us continue telling stories that challenge, inspire, and shift the culture toward justice with humanity at its heart. Your support fuels the next voice that needs to be heard. And together, we'll make sure the silence never wins again.